Welcome back, everyone. Tonight's story begins with a girl who thought she was hired to clean. She wasn't. She was hired because 6 maids before her had quit, 2 had requested transfers to the border outposts, which, if you know anything about border outposts, tells you everything. And the pack's head housekeeper had run out of options and was starting to run out of dignity. The position was simple on paper: maintain the east wing, change the linens, keep the fire. Do not, under any circumstances, attempt to engage the occupant. The occupant was the Lycan King's son, and the Lycan King's son had not slept in 11 days. What that meant for everyone in a stone fortress with good acoustics, she was about to find out. Let's begin. Her name was Maren, and she arrived on a Tuesday with a canvas bag, a change of clothes, and the particular calm of someone who had grown up in a household where calm was the only currency that's spent. The head housekeeper, a woman named Petra, whose left eye had developed a persistent twitch sometime in the last week and a half, met her at the servants' entrance and handed her a key on a ring that had clearly been gripped and re-gripped until the metal was warm. "East wing," Petra said. "3rd floor. The fire needs to be maintained at all times. The linens are changed on Tuesdays and Fridays, but do not enter the room on Fridays. Do not enter the room if you can hear him. Do not enter the room if the corridor smells like—" She stopped, reconsidered. "You'll know." Maren looked at the key. "What does he eat?" Petra blinked. It was apparently not the question she'd expected. "He doesn't. Not consistently. We leave trays outside the door." "Does he eat them?" "Sometimes he throws them." "At the door or at the wall?" Petra's eye twitched. "Does it matter?" Maren considered. "It tells you whether he's directing the anger at someone specific or just releasing it." The silence that followed was the kind that meant Petra was reconsidering whether this particular maid was going to be a solution or a new variety of problem. Then she said, "The wall. Mostly the wall," and pressed the key more firmly into Maren's hand as though completing a transaction she wasn't sure was wise. The east wing smelled like iron and old stone, and something underneath both of those things that Maren couldn't name yet. She filed it away. The corridor was long and cold, the torches burning lower than they should have been. Someone had stopped maintaining them, which told her something about how long the situation had been deteriorating. She replaced 2 of the torches from the supply closet at the corridor's end, restocked the oil, and had the passage properly lit before she reached the door at the far end. She stood outside it for a moment. From inside, nothing. Which was, she would later understand, either very good or very bad, and the only way to know which was to open the door. She opened the door. The room was large and cold, and in a state that told a story she didn't need anyone to narrate for her. The fire was dead. The linens were twisted into a shape that suggested someone had been fighting them rather than sleeping under them. 3 trays were stacked against the far wall. Not thrown, she noted, stacked, which meant someone in there retained enough order to create categories even in distress. The window was open despite the cold, and the curtains were moving in a way that made the shadows shift constantly, restlessly, like the room itself couldn't settle. In the corner, on the floor, rather than the bed, sat Caius. He was 17, which she knew from Petra's briefing. He looked both younger and older than that, in the way that people do when they've been awake too long. The face softening toward something unguarded, while the eyes went in the opposite direction, harder and more remote. He was in his Lycan form, not fully, but enough, the particular in-between state that she'd read about but never seen, where the human architecture remained but the edges of it had gone feral, the jaw slightly wrong, the hands not quite hands, the eyes a color that didn't exist in the human spectrum. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, "The fire's out. I'm going to rebuild it." He said nothing. His eyes tracked her across the room with the flat attention of something that was deciding whether she was a threat. She moved to the fireplace, knelt, and began clearing the ash with the efficiency of someone who had rebuilt fires in difficult rooms before, which she had, because she had grown up in a household where the fires were always going out, and there was always something difficult in the room. She didn't speak again. She didn't hum yet. That came later, and it came the way most important things come, which is by accident. She rebuilt the fire. She collected the trays without comment. She changed the linens on the bed, working around the fact that the occupant of the room was watching her from the floor with the kind of attention that would have made most people move faster. She moved at exactly the same speed throughout, which was the only thing she knew how to do when something was watching her, because speed changes read as fear, and fear in a room that already smelled like iron seemed unwise. When she was done, she stood, looked at the fire to confirm it had caught properly, and turned toward the door. "You're not going to say anything." His voice was rougher than it should have been, not the roughness of adolescence, but the roughness of a voice that had been used to make sounds that weren't words. 11 days, she reminded herself. 11 days without sleep did things to the edges of a person. She turned back. "Is there something you want me to say?" He stared at her. She had the impression he was trying to find the angle of her. The fear, the calculation, the performance of not being afraid that was itself a kind of fear. She watched him not find it and file that away too. "The others talked," he said, "constantly, about nothing." "I notice the wall is very clean on the left side," she said, "near the window." Something shifted in his expression. Not much, just a fraction. "They scrubbed it." "After the trays?" "After the trays," he confirmed. She nodded once. The way you nod when information has been confirmed rather than learned. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said, "for the fire." She left. In the corridor, she stood for a moment with her back against the cold stone and did the things she did when she was processing. She counted the torches. There were 7. There had been 7 when she arrived. She counted them again. 7. Then she walked back down the corridor toward the servants' stair, and she did not think about the color of his eyes, which had been the color of something burning from the inside out. She thought about it later. She filed it where she filed things that needed more time. On the second day, she rebuilt the fire and changed nothing else. He was on the floor again, in the same corner, but his eyes were closed when she entered, which was either sleep or the performance of sleep, and she treated it the same way regardless, quietly, efficiently, without language. She was nearly done when she caught herself. She'd been humming. She didn't know when she'd started. It was something her mother had done, a tune without a name, the kind that didn't go anywhere in particular and didn't need to. She stopped the moment she noticed, the silence landing in the room like a change in pressure. From the corner, without opening his eyes, "Don't stop." She held very still. He stopped, started again, carefully, like someone picking up something fragile. "It's easier when there's that." She stood there for a moment with her hands full of the old ash she'd been clearing and the particular weight of a request from someone who hadn't known they were going to make one. Then she started humming again. The same tune. No beginning, no end, just the middle of it, which was all she'd ever really known. She finished the fire. She collected the ash. She left. He was still on the floor when she went. But his breathing had changed. She filed that away too. On the 4th day, he was on the bed, not sleeping. She'd learned by then to tell the difference, and the difference was in the quality of the stillness, which in sleep had a softness to it, and in wakefulness had an edge, even when he was trying to hide the edge. But he was on the bed, which was not nothing, and the linens were less destroyed than they had been. which was also not nothing. She rebuilt the fire. She hummed from the beginning this time, not waiting to be asked, because the room felt like it needed it the way a room with a dead fire needs heat. Not as comfort, but as necessity. She heard him shift behind her, the small sounds of a body adjusting, settling, the particular creak of a mattress under someone who is trying to find a position that works. "What is that?" he said. Not a question exactly, more like thinking aloud. "A song my mother sang." "What's it called?" "I don't know. She didn't know either. She said she got it from her mother, who probably got it from someone else." She set the last log in place and watched the fire catch. Songs like that don't usually have names. They just get passed along. The silence behind her had changed texture, less iron in it. "My mother used to sing," he said, and then stopped, and she understood from the stopping that this was not a thing he'd said before, or at least not recently, and that it had surprised him to say it now. She didn't turn around. She understood, without being told, that this was the kind of thing that needed the absence of a face to land properly. "Was she good?" Maren asked. A pause. Then, with something in it she couldn't quite name. "I don't remember if she was good. I just remember that it was her." She finished with the fire and stood. She hummed the last few bars of the tune, the part that didn't resolve, that just faded into something adjacent to silence, and then let it go. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. She went. In the corridor she counted the torches. 7. She stood there for longer than she needed to, doing nothing, which was unusual for her. Then she went down the stairs and did not think about a boy who remembered his mother's voice, but not whether it was beautiful, because that was the kind of thing that could take up too much space if you let it, and she had work in the morning. On the 6th day, she arrived to find him standing at the window. This was new. Standing was new. The window was open the way it always was, the cold coming through in the particular way of east-facing windows in autumn, and he was standing in it with his hands on the frame and his back to the door. And for a moment she simply stood in the doorway and registered the change the way you register a change in weather. Not surprised exactly, but noting it. He said without turning, "Petra told the king." She set her bag down. "Told him what?" "That someone found a way to—" He stopped. His hands tightened on the window frame. "That I've been sleeping." She crossed to the fireplace and began her work. "Is that a problem?" "He wants to meet you." She paused. Not visibly. She had a good hold on visible pauses. But internally, the thing that had been proceeding in an orderly fashion stopped and rearranged itself. She continued clearing the ash. "All right. You're not—" He turned then, and she saw his face in the morning light, which was different from the firelight she'd been seeing him in, and what was different about it was that it looked more like a face than it had before, less like something bracing. "You're not concerned? Should I be?" He studied her with the eyes that were still not quite the right color, still burning from somewhere interior, but less so than they had been, less feral at the edges. "Most people are concerned about meeting the king." "I expect he has questions," she said. "I'll answer them." Caius was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He's going to ask how you did it." "I rebuilt the fire and hummed a song with no name." She sat back on her heels and looked at the fire, which was catching cleanly now, the way fires caught when they'd been properly laid. "That's all I did." "That's not all you did," he said, and his voice had something in it that was neither rough nor smooth, but something between, the voice of someone who had been finding his way back to language and was almost there. She looked at him. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked back out the window. "You didn't treat me like something broken," he said. You treated me like someone who needed a fire and some quiet. A pause. There's a difference. She looked at the fire. Yes, she said. There is. She hummed the rest of the morning, the tune moving through the room like something that had always been there, and he stood at the window for a while. And then, at some point that she didn't mark precisely because she'd learned not to mark it too precisely, he sat on the bed, and then he lay down. And then his breathing changed, and then he slept, in full daylight, for the first time in 17 days. She kept the fire and let him sleep and hummed until the tune ran out, and then started it again from the beginning, and the morning went on around them both, ordinary and quiet and entirely sufficient. The meeting with the king happened on Friday. She had been warned not to enter the East Wing on Fridays, but no one had warned her about anything else. So she arrived at the indicated hour at the door of the great hall and knocked, and was admitted by a man who moved the way Caius moved, the particular stillness of wolves in human form who had stopped pretending entirely, and was shown to a chair in front of a table at which the king was seated. He was not what she had expected, which she noted without knowing exactly what she had expected. He was large the way old trees are large, not imposing through effort but through time, through accumulated weight. His hair was gray at the temples. His eyes were the same color as Caius's, which answered a question she hadn't known she was asking. He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze. Petra tells me you've been maintaining the East Wing, he said. Yes. She tells me my son has slept. He said it the way he might say the sun rose in the west, with the particular care of someone describing something they are still in the process of believing. He has. How? She told him. Fire, linens, a song with no name, silence when silence was needed, and presence when presence was needed. She told him about the trays stacked against the wall and what that had told her. She told him about not turning around when he'd mentioned his mother. She told him none of it was a technique, that she had simply, she paused here, choosing the word, attended to the room, and the room happened to have a person in it who needed the same things rooms need: heat, quiet, consistency. The king was silent for a long time after she finished. He hasn't slept, the king said, since his mother died, 2 years. He looked at his hands, which were flat on the table, and then back at her. The healers said it was a Lycan response to grief, that the feral state was his body refusing to be still, because being still meant... He stopped. Meant feeling it, she said. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. He's not refusing anymore, she said. I don't know if that's permanent, but he's not refusing right now. The king looked at her with the eyes that were his son's eyes and said, What do you need? To continue. She thought about it. Better firewood. The East Wing supply is damp, and... She paused. He should have a dog, I think. Something that needs attending to. It helps to have something that needs you back. The king blinked. It was, she suspected, not the answer he'd been braced for. Something shifted in his expression. Not relief exactly, something more careful than relief. And he said, I'll see to both. She nodded and stood to leave. Maren? She turned back. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, which was unusual for her. He said you hum. Yes. What song? I don't know its name, she said. My mother didn't know either. He was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, as though confirming something he'd already known, it was her song, his mother's. She used to hum it in the... He stopped. His jaw tightened. She made it up, she said. She thought she made it up. Maren stood very still. Songs like that, she said carefully, don't usually have one origin. They get passed along. The king looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Yes, I suppose they do." She left the great hall and stood in the corridor outside it and did not count the torches, which were 12 because she wasn't counting anymore. She stood there and let the information settle into her the way cold settles into stone, slowly, thoroughly, into all the places where there was room for it. Then she went back up to the east wing because the fire needed maintaining, and because there was a boy up there who was sleeping for the first time in 2 years, and she had told someone she would be there in the morning. She was there in the morning. On the 8th day, the dog arrived. It was not a small dog. She had not specified small, which she acknowledged was her own oversight. It was a wolfhound, gray and enormous, and possessed of the particular dignity of very large dogs who have decided that dignity is the only appropriate response to their own size. It arrived in the East Wing corridor in the arms of a stable hand who looked relieved to transfer custody, and Maren took the lead and brought it to the door of Caius's room and knocked. A pause. Then, "What?" "You have a dog." A longer pause. "I don't want a dog." "He doesn't know that yet," she said. "He's been in the stable and he'd like to come in." Silence. Then the sound of the bolt drawing back, and the door opened, and Caius looked at the wolfhound with the expression of someone who has been presented with something they didn't ask for and cannot immediately find an objection to. The wolfhound looked back at him with the calm assessment of a creature that had already decided the situation was acceptable. "He's enormous," Caius said. "Yes." "What's his name?" "He doesn't have one yet." Caius looked at her. Then he looked at the dog. Then he stepped back from the door, which was an invitation if she'd ever seen one, and the wolfhound walked in with the measured confidence of someone who had been expected. She didn't follow. She stood in the doorway and watched Caius sit on the floor. His floor, the corner that had been his corner for 11 days of not sleeping, and the wolfhound walk directly to him and sit down beside him with the gravity of a creature fulfilling a purpose. Caius put his hand on the dog's back. She watched his shoulders drop. Just slightly. Just a fraction. The kind of drop that happens when something that has been held up for a very long time is finally allowed to rest against something else. She said, "I'll be back for the fire." He didn't answer. He was looking at the dog with an expression she didn't have a word for, which was unusual for her, because she usually had words. She pulled the door mostly closed and stood in the corridor and counted nothing, because there was nothing she needed to count. 3 weeks passed. The East Wing was different by then in the way that rooms become different when they are inhabited rather than occupied. Small signs of a life organizing itself. A book left open on the windowsill. A bowl that had been used and set aside rather than thrown. The wolfhound's water dish beside the hearth itself burning the way fires burn when someone has started taking an interest in their own warmth. Caius had a name for the dog. He hadn't told her what it was, and she hadn't asked, and she knew it the way she knew most things in the East Wing, by inference, by the way he said it quietly when he thought she wasn't listening. A single syllable that she couldn't quite catch, but that sounded, she thought, like the beginning of something. He slept every night now. She knew because Petra told her, and Petra told her with the specific relief of someone who has been carrying a weight for 2 years, and has only recently been allowed to set it down. The eye twitch was mostly gone. The key ring had been returned to its hook. The border outpost transfers had been quietly rescinded. On a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week, she arrived to find Caius sitting at the table rather than the floor, eating from a tray rather than ignoring it, with the wolfhound's head in his lap and a book open beside the bowl. He looked up when she came in. She noted that the fire was still burning. He had maintained it through the night. "You kept it going," she said. "It seemed reasonable," he said, "given that you'd built it." She set down her bag and looked at the fire, which was burning at exactly the right level. Not too high, not too low, the kind of fire that had been tended by someone who had been paying attention. You did it correctly. I've been watching you for 3 weeks. She looked at him. He looked back at her, and there was something in his face that had not been there on the first day. Not softness exactly, but the absence of the bracing, the particular quality of a face that has stopped preparing for impact. The dog needs a name, she said. He has one. What is it? A pause. The wolfhound lifted its enormous head from Caius's lap and looked at her with the calm attention of a creature that already knew the answer. Caius looked at the dog, then at her, with the expression of someone who is about to say something they have not said before. Maren, he said. I named him Maren. She stood very still. That's... She stopped, started again. That's my name. I know. He looked back at the book. He kept going to the door when you left, every time. For the first week, every time you left, he went to the door and sat there. He turned a page, which she suspected was not actually a page he was reading. It seemed accurate. She looked at the wolfhound, who was looking back at her with the serene dignity of a creature who had been correctly identified. She picked up the fire tools and began her work, and she was humming before she knew it. The tune without a name moving through the room the way it always did. No beginning, no end, just the middle of it. And behind her she heard the sound of Caius setting the book down, and the wolfhound settling back into his lap, and the fire doing what fires do when they've been properly kept. The room was warm. It had been warm for 3 weeks, and it was going to be warm tomorrow. And that was, she thought, exactly enough. The king came to the east wing on a morning in late autumn, when the frost had come down overnight and left the stones of the corridor white and precise in the early light. She heard him before she saw him. The particular weight of his step, heavier than his son's, the specific silence that moved ahead of a Lycan King the way weather moves ahead of a storm, not threatening, but simply large. She was in the corridor replacing a torch when he arrived. She stepped aside. He stopped. How is he? The king said. Sleeping, she said. Eating. He maintained the fire last night himself. Something moved across the king's face. The expression of a father receiving information he had stopped letting himself hope for, receiving it now in small plain words from a girl with a torch in her hands in a cold corridor. He looked at the door at the end of the hall. May I? He stopped. The king of the Lycan pack, stopping to ask permission in his own fortress. She understood what it cost him and what it meant that he was paying it. I'll tell him you're here, she said. She knocked. Caius answered. She said quietly that his father was in the corridor. The silence on the other side of the door was the kind that does a great deal of work in a short amount of time. Then the bolt drew back. She returned to the torch. Behind her, she heard the king enter the room, and then the door close, and then nothing. The particular nothing of a conversation happening in a room with good walls and 2 people who had things to say that had been waiting 2 years to be said. She replaced the torch and stood in the corridor in the frost-white morning and hummed the tune with no name, quietly, to no one in particular. And the corridor was cold, and the fire at the far end was burning, and somewhere behind a closed door, a father and a son were finding their way back to each other in the particular stumbling way that people do when they've been lost for a long time, and the path back is shorter than they thought. She hummed until the tune ran out. Then she started it again. She was on the last bars when the door opened and the king came out. He looked at her for a moment, and his eyes were the same color as his son's, and they had the same quality in them now, not burning from the inside out, but simply lit, the difference between a fire out of control and a fire doing what it was meant to do. He said, "Thank you." She said, "The firewood is better. It makes a difference." He almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that she was beginning to understand was the family's version of a full one. "Yes," he said, "I imagine it does." He looked down the corridor, then back at her. "You'll stay, in this position, as long as you want it." "I'll stay," she said, "as long as the fire needs keeping." He nodded once, the nod of someone who understands that this is a different kind of promise than it sounds like. Then he walked back down the corridor, his step still heavy, still large, but with something different in it. The weight of a man who has set something down rather than the weight of a man who is carrying it. She turned back to the door, knocked once. "Come in," Caius said. She came in. The wolfhound, Maren, which she was still in the process of having feelings about, was at the window, looking out at the frost-covered yard with the focused attention of a dog who has spotted something interesting at a distance. Caius was at the table. The fire was burning. The book was open, but not being read. He looked at her when she entered, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there was a particular kind of conversation that had been happening in this room for 3 weeks that didn't require words, and this was one of those moments. Then he said, "He cried." She crossed to the fireplace and checked the fire, which didn't need checking but gave her something to do with her hands. "Is that good?" he said. Yes, it was good. A pause. "He said he'd been afraid to come in, to the east wing. He said he was afraid of what he'd find." Another pause, longer. "He said he'd been afraid for 2 years that I was too far gone to come back." She kept her eyes on the fire. "You weren't," she said. "No." He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't." He said it like someone confirming a fact they have recently verified. "I just needed—" He stopped. She waited. "I needed someone to treat the room like it was worth keeping warm." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the dog, who had abandoned the window and returned to his place beside the table, with the loyalty of a creature that had chosen its person and was done reconsidering. "The room was always worth keeping warm," she said. He looked at her then. His eyes were the right color now, not burning from the inside out, not the color that didn't exist in the human spectrum, but something that was simply his, particular and steady. The eyes of someone who has found their way back to the surface and is learning to stay there. "I know," he said. "I know that now." She picked up the tune from wherever she'd left it in the corridor and let it move through the room. And the fire burned the way fires burn when they've been properly kept. And the wolfhound put his enormous head on Caius's foot, and outside the frost-covered yard was beginning to catch the morning light. And the day went on the way days go on when the worst thing has passed, and what's left is simply the ordinary business of being warm and present and alive. She stayed until the fire was settled. She would come back tomorrow. She had told someone she would, and she kept the things she told people. And the fire would need tending, and the room would need keeping, and there was a boy in it who was learning, slowly, in the particular stumbling way of someone who has been bracing for a long time, how to stop. She hummed the last few bars of the tune as she went, the part that didn't resolve, that faded into something adjacent to silence, and she let it go in the corridor. And the corridor held it for a moment, the way cold stone holds warmth, briefly, thoroughly, longer than you'd expect. Then she went down the stairs, and the morning continued, and the east wing stayed warm. And that's where we leave them. A girl who arrived with a canvas bag and a song she didn't know the name of. A boy who hadn't slept in 2 years and named a dog after the person who made him feel safe enough to try. And a tune that traveled from a mother to a daughter to a grieving boy in a cold room, without anyone knowing it was the same song. I need to know what you thought of Maren, because she didn't arrive with a cure or a plan or a grand gesture. She arrived with a fire kit and the sense to stay quiet at the right moments. Drop in the comments. Was that enough? Was it everything? And if this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who needs a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is simply keep showing up and keep the room warm. It helps more than you know. I'll see you in the next one.